All right, let's do some sprite slice manipulation. Here's what I want to do today, and that is a common problem that I have, and I'm sure a lot of people have it, and that is we have a texture. We've got a texture with a bunch of nice little sprites on it. I'll show you the texture I'm using. I'm using one from OpenGameArt, and it's just a bunch of roguelike items, rings, amulets, swords, weapons, armor, things of that nature, books. And here's the page where I got it from. So we're going to use that for illustration purposes, and I have them right here. I've already imported them, set their sprite mode to multiple, and gone into the sprite editor, sliced them all up into these nice little 16 by 16 squares. So here comes the issue, and that is I would love to be able to rename, say, all the rings. But I can't, because you can't do multiple selections in here. You can't do renames, etc. But this is the only place that you can set the names, at least in the editor. So in order to set a name, I would just have to set it right here, and then that would become ring. And then I would have to remember, oh, well, this is a ring 2, and I would just want to call it ring 1. You get my drift? So renaming all this is a bummer. It's really a chore. So let's see what we can do to knock it out a little bit better and make it to where we don't have to go to so much trouble. So that at least that we can say, come into this texture that's been set as a sprite, a multiple sprite, already sliced. Pull down this little triangle. Select, say, the items we want to rename. Say we want to select all the rings, which we're not really selecting all the rings. There are several more rings than that. But say we want to select these first 6. And we want to like right click, or maybe we want a window over here or something that will let us say, okay, click this, and then we can rename all of these that we have selected to a particular identifier of some sort, and then just an incrementing value. So at least we could say, okay, rename all these to ring, and then it would automatically go through and assign 0, 1, 2, 3 for those. So that's what I'm looking for, and that's what we're going to try to do. And so with that, this is basically an empty project. And one thing, let's go ahead and do, and that is I want to go into build settings, or I'm sorry, player settings. And okay, good. So we are at .NET 4 equivalent. Just want to make sure that everybody knows that, because we're going to use a couple of nice C#6 features when we're doing this. So I'm going to go into this directory I created, scripts, in editor, and I'm going to create a C# script, and I'm going to call it sprite utils. Does that make sense to me? So I'm going to open up the meta file for that roguelike items ping file, and you can see looks pretty obvious where the names are. And if we come down here below this declaration of these file IDs with the name, and we'll do a search for roguelike items 0 down here, and you'll see that this is obviously where it is describing where that slice is and what it looks like. Pretty cool, huh? And then there's the second one, roguelike items _1. There's the X and Y offset location where that slice is in this texture. So what we can do then is we can instead use this meta file and basically manipulate the meta file. So we'll find what we want to rename, and we'll change it. And there are just 2 places where each of these names occur. So you'll see a place here, and then again, as we said, you'll see a place down here where that slice is actually described. So that's where the slices are actually stored whenever you slice a texture. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because the texture itself is, you're not changing that data, so you've got to put that slice data somewhere. Well, Unity puts it in the meta file. So let's manipulate the meta file. So what we're going to do is we got the sprite utils here. We'll open up Visual Studio, and I'm going to make this a static class because we really don't need it to be a mono behavior. We're actually going to use some editor functions. So we'll say static, and I know that we're going to need to use Unity editor, so I'll go ahead and stick that in here. And I will start out by, we'll use a static class void, and we're just going to call it test. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to come in here and right click on this texture, and I want something to appear in the menu that I can click that will call this function, this static function. Well, just so happens Unity has something like that, and it's the attribute called menu item. So we'll stick menu item on here, and in order for it to appear in that right click menu, it needs to be in assets, and then you have the / and then you tell it what you want to call it. So we just want to call it test. So if we go back, you'll see now when it recompiles that we get test, and since it does nothing, I'm not going to click it right now. But what we want to do is we want to grab, well, let's prove that we can grab, we want the path of this file. Okay, so that's pretty easy, it turns out. Unity has, in the editor, has a class called selection, and there is a function, or there's a field in selection called active object, which is the active object you have selected currently. So we can use that. We can use that along with another class, since we're looking for the path in the asset database. There's a class called asset database, and it has some static methods attached to it. Well, we want to get an asset path. Guess what that takes? It takes a couple of different things, either an instance ID or the actual object you want the path for. Well, the object you want the path for, as I just said, was selection dot active object. And if we do that, we will have the path that we desire. So what we need to do is set that equal to a variable that we can use. So if we debug.log that, you'll see that that path is where we would expect it. It should be under assets, textures, roguelike items.ping. And we also know that the meta file will just be this path plus a .meta appended to it, which is really just going to be that, right? No problem. That's easy. Okay. What we want, though, I don't want the right-click menu to come up whenever I select this, or maybe I do. Maybe I want to be able to rename them all, including the whole file. See, if I can rename this file to something, all of these are still the same. Let's see. I think I can just undo that, right? Undo the rename. Okay, I'll just rename it. No problem. So what I'm thinking is, when we select this, I don't want this to be available. But when we select one of these, I want this to be available. And by the way, these are considered to actually be sprites. And this is a texture, texture 2D. So there is another interesting override to the menu item attribute. And I'll show you what that is. And that is, we can make a validation function for this menu call. If you look, there's a bool here, is validate function. And if we put true in here, then we can make a static, let's say is sprite. So then all we have to do is we can get whatever selected objects we have, and we can validate whether or not they are what we want. And if they are, we return true, which lets us execute this test function. Otherwise, I'll show you. Let's just hard code return false here. We'll right click on any of this stuff, and you'll see that test is grayed out. So it still shows up, but it's just grayed out. So we can actually use that. So what do we want? Well, we want, first of all, I think, at least for now, we want to validate that we can select multiple items. We want to make sure that all of those items that are selected are sprites, and we want to make sure that the texture that all of those selections occur on are from the same, basically they're from the same texture, because we don't want to get into renaming from different textures. We're just going to constrict that and say when you do renames, you do multiple renames from a single texture at a time. So first, I'm going to comment this out for now, and we're going to go and I'll show you how you can get multiple selected objects. It turns out to be pretty easy. So we'll set an objects variable to be equal to, you guessed it, selection is going to have our solution in there, and that's going to be objects. So those are the objects that are selected. So then we can go into a for each loop, and then we can say debug.log. This is important because you're going to see something that we're going to need to fix. Object.name. So now when I run this, we'll see all of the objects we have selected printed here. But notice when I do it, I'm selecting 0 through 11. Notice that they're out of order. Well, that won't do. What I'm thinking is from the top, what I call the top, or the first item here, down this way would be the way I would want it ordered. And so from what I can tell, the way to do that is, instead of getting them this way, is to instead get them this way. So let's grab their IDs. So the selection.instance IDs will give us all of the instance IDs that are selected, and those are unique values that Unity uses in the database to refer to each item. So we can now say, we'll do a for each over this, and then we'll say we can get that object, we'll say obj, from an editor utility function, a static function that's called instance ID to object, which is exactly what we want. Basically, it's looking it up in the database, in Unity's database for your particular project, and it's pulling that object out. And then if we were to print those, we will find that the order, at least initially, now I guess I haven't completely verified this, but we're going to roll with it this way. The order is going to be the way we would expect, which is 0 through 12. So we're gonna run with this particular method. You could do this method, but you're going to get a weird ordering, and that may or may not be something that you care about. I don't know. So one of the other things that we need to do, so we need to verify that all of these objects, so let's get the type. We want to verify that these are all types of sprites. I know that's not the most efficient way to do it, but we're building some building blocks here. So if I said these test, we should get trues. And if I said this test, we should get nothing, which is exactly what we want. We should not get any trues. Yes. Okay. So additionally, if it is a type of sprite, then we can cast it to a sprite, because that object is actually a sprite. Why do we want to do this? Because we want to find out what that sprite's texture is. What's the name of the texture? Because that's what we're going to look at. We want to restrict, again, we want to restrict selections to being in the same texture. So we'll just rename within the texture. But that's no problem. That's typically what you want to do anyway. So now when we do this, we select 3 or 4 of these little fellows, and then we say test, we'll get the roguelike items, which is the name of the actual texture. So good. That's good. So let's put all of this into our validation function now. So let's say is renameable I'm going to say can rename sprites. How about that? So we'll do basically this. Let's just grab this stuff here. We'll start with this, and we will put in what I call a texture name, and we'll set that equal to an empty string. So here's what we'll do. We'll go through all of the selected items, and we can actually do this. We'll say if that item is not a type of sprite, then we're just going to go ahead and return false, because no reason to continue looking at this stuff. But if we make it through the for each loop, we're going to return true because they've all passed our test. So here it's kind of a short circuit. If any of these is not a sprite, we return false. We don't want to try to rename them if they're not sprites, because that's all we're doing here. Otherwise, we'll say else if string is null or empty. So we want somebody to set what the texture name is. So if that hasn't been set, then we will set that texture name I'll change my mind. We're going to do that, but we will first do this. We know it's a sprite, so we'll cast it as a sprite. Then we will say if that texture name is null, then let's set the texture name to that current sprite's texture.name. And then we'll say else if. So then we're gonna, otherwise we're gonna compare that first texture. So the first sprite that we get, we're gonna say, well, that's the texture that we're gonna make sure all of the other sprites match. They've all got to be from the same texture. So we're gonna make sure that that's the case. So we'll say sprite.texture.name. So we'll compare it to texture name. So if it's not, again, we're gonna do the little return false. So if it makes it through here, we'll say, hey, you can rename these sprites. Otherwise, you can't. So let's see what we get. Let's see if I did that right. Clear that out. If I right click on these, we should see that. So if I right click on this, we don't. And then just in order to make sure that we're going to duplicate that, and I'll select some items in that duplicated one. I'm going to actually call it dupe. We'll select a few here, and we'll select a few here, and I shouldn't be able to, and that is indeed working like we want. Great! Wonderful! So I'll close this one, this one. So that validation function is indeed validating that we have all, the sprites we've selected are all in the same texture, what we want. So what we'll do in the next part is we'll start to look at the meta file that I showed you a little bit earlier, and we'll see how we can grab this stuff and do renames, because that's what we're gonna work on next. So until then, we will see you later.